Hello, everyone. Welcome to the July Lunch and Learn. Presenting for us today is Dr. Nikolas Smilovsky. If you want to introduce yourself. Yep, there you go.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to introduce myself in the silence. No, I appreciate that, Andrew. Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Smilovsky. If you are unfamiliar with me or have not heard of me on LinkedIn or at some type of various GIS events, I figure I'd give you a quick background of the dude you're listening to for the next little bit. I've got a background of the last 20 years in geospatial. I originally went to the University of Florida for a bachelor's in history and anthropology with a minor in education. Got to run a total station for a field school, learned about mapping and used GIS. From there, I got a master's in GIS from Arizona State University, which you can see actually up in the corner here. Go Sun Devils as well. From that point, I've been teaching at Arizona State for roughly 14 years. When I graduated with my master's, they asked me to come in and teach some master's level classes. During that time, I also was able to complete a PhD in geographic, basically the behavior of geography and how we look at our environments and interact with our environments to make decisions, and specifically in urban environments with a perception of safety and trust. And during this whole time, I have worked on the private side at various different firms, whether it was mapping trees, working for landscape architecture and design firms, working for engineering firms in the utility business, or as you can see on my shirt here, it says Bad Elf. So currently I wear two hats. I am a professor at Arizona State University Online for GIS. And then I'm also the director of geospatial enablement and solutions at Bad Elf, where I help implement, teach, train people how to use GIS, but more specifically use GPS, Bad Elf GPS, to go out and collect really great data. You might be thinking to yourself, wow, that's a whole lot of random things. And you're totally right. I've got a really crazy, wild, hyper interdisciplined background. And at the center of everything, and I could get into more minutia with you, but the reality is in the middle of all of the things that I just discussed is maps. I love maps. I freaking love maps. I don't know how else I can express this to everybody. Like, maps are my life. And so today we're going to take a little bit of a journey through some of my personal life, maybe some of your own lives, and you're going to be able to reflect and correlate, associate to your own experiences about maps. And we're just going to have a little bit of fun. Usually I follow, I'm very regimented and I talk about the technical. Today is more of sit back, grab your lunch, grab your coffee, whatever, and enjoy, right? So we're just going to take a little journey together. I'll probably talk for about 45 minutes or so, maybe a little shorter. And we're going to leave time at the end to have a discussion. And so in the chat, if you at any time have a question, comment, concern, an idea, a thought, I'm going to challenge you to please put it in the chat, and we'll take a tangent and we'll talk about it. And if we don't get to them, we can certainly talk at the end. And I would love to have kind of a little collaborative discussion just on our experiences with maps. And after the show, if y'all have any follow-up, please just reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn. And then I know Pam has all my credentials and email address, phone numbers. I'm out there. I'm an enthusiast. I love geospatial, love GIS, love maps. Please reach out to me. So that's the introduction. That's who I am. I'm here on behalf of ASU and Bad Elf. Now let's talk a little bit about marvelous maps that make our world. Okay. Without further ado, today's agenda. Well, usually the agenda is the thing that keeps me on task. I am absolutely diagnosed ADHD, and I follow squirrels all the time. And if I don't have an agenda, I usually can't stay focused. However, we're going to get off the beaten path today. That's a bad map joke, right? We're going to not be on the path on the map. We're going to make our own path. And again, go through a little bit of a story arc together on why maps are marvelous. And so at the beginning here, we're going to have this inciting kind of plot narrative where I'm going to build in you that excitement that maps are for me, why I do GIS, why I do mapping. And I think you're going to relate to it. And we're going to rise and we're going to get to this climax where we're like, the pinnacle of mapping, and we're going to come back down the bell curve, and we're going to resolve, and we're going to have hopefully a kumbaya moment at the end where we all are enjoying maps and going out into the world and spreading and disseminating our love for maps, because maps have been helping people make better decisions since the beginning of brains. And in our most recent cognitive rendition of the brain, if you were going back to the beginning of Homo sapiens and even before that, all primates that have advanced brain structures, what we're going to see here is we all use mapping. So I'm going to stray from the agenda and the regimented, itemized task today, and we're going to have a little bit of fun talking about maps. Well, can't have a high-tech conversation without a Wikipedia definition of a map, right? So hopefully most of us here know what maps are, but I think it's important to read through this together just briefly, not the whole thing, because maybe your thought of what a map is might be a little different than the person virtually sitting next to you. So Wikipedia says a map is a symbolic, that's important, depiction emphasizing relationships between elements of some space, such as objects, regions, or themes. Maps can be static, fixed to paper, or some other durable medium, maybe Mylar, if you're old enough to remember Mylar sheets and how we used to draft and map, while others are dynamic and interactive. I literally think ArcGIS Online, right? Although most commonly used to depict geography, maps may represent any space, real or fictional, without regard to context or scale, such as brain mapping, cognitive mapping. We're going to talk about this more. Mind mapping, if you will, or DNA mapping. Perhaps we're trying to figure out the context of who we are, and we want to look at all the DNA and RNA strands. That's a type of mapping. Or computer network topology mapping, right? So perhaps you're thinking about neural networks and you're creating artificial intelligence. There is a map to that, right? Your brain uses these maps as well. The space being mapped may be two-dimensional, such as the surface of the Earth, three-dimensional, such as the interior of the Earth, or even more abstract spaces of any dimension, such as a rise in modeling phenomena having many independent variables. When I think of abstract spaces, I think about the maps that we use on a day-to-day basis. Again, think about maybe you sat in a project meeting at your organization and you put a mind map on the board where you had a central concept or theme. That's that center radial thing, right? And maybe that center thing is saving money. I don't know. I'm just making things up on the fly. And from saving money, you have all these different ideas that branch from that have to do with saving money. And then those ideas branch to another thing, right? Think about model builder, for an example, if you're in an Esri shop and you want to do some coding, right? Or repetitive tasks or iterative tasks that need to go down a sequential line of actions. That is also a map. And so we often think about maps as like this treasure map that Jack Sparrow uses to find, you know, the lost treasures of Davy Jones or whatever, right? We think of maps a lot of times as perhaps archaeological maps, but there's so many more things that maps are. Literally, the word map comes from medieval Latin, mappy mundi, which mappa meant napkin or cloth, and mundi, the world. So in a way, maps were literally hand-drawn. And so with that in mind, let's dive into some different types of maps. And I guess it's important to note then, if maps are all these things, what's cartography, right? There's all these kind of GIS, cartography, geospatial, all these different terms. Well, maps are one thing, but keep in mind that cartography is actually more of the practice of creating the map. It's the study and practice of making and using the maps, combining science and aesthetics. I always say the art of making a good map is like 50% math and science and 50% art. Personally, I don't know, maybe I'm just a total nerd, but I love urban planning and landscape architecture maps. Have you ever seen a really cool like master plan map for a municipality or design for some type of large new facility or park? They are beautiful. They not only convey a narrative of what's happening, but they are beautiful and aesthetically pleasing, so they engage us. Have you ever looked at a really bad map and super boring, or it's super cluttered or confusing? It just like turns you away and you don't care to read it. It's like bad writing. You don't want to read it if it's not good, right? So cartography is more of the practice of making maps. If you do GIS at some level, you are in the field of cartography and creating maps, right? You make maps. You are the cartographic people and professionals of this age, right? We are the advocates for maps. And I would even push so far as to say we're in a geospatial moment we'll talk about later. And this geospatial moment requires us to be good stewards of maps. Okay, so I've talked a few times about maps and brains. So a lot of my dissertation was on how our brain uses maps. This dude here, right? This guy, love him to death. He's one of my main people I studied. His name is E.C. Tolman. Tolman was around in the early 1900s, and he was a professor at UC Berkeley, and he wrote a very famous paper you can see here that was published in 1948 called Cognitive Maps in Rats and Men. And you can see here on the screen that there's this maze, and what Tolman postulated and proved, most importantly, was rats and men, and really any creature, mammal type creature that has advanced brains, from a cat to a dog to a wolf to a whatever, a sheep, to us, that these biological creatures utilize maps in their brain, cognitive maps, so to speak, for utilitarian purposes like finding food. And so he created these mazes and he put the rats in there, and the rats had to get through the maze, and he shifted and moved and he did all the different types of things. Suffice to say, what he was able to quantify was that when the rats ran through the maze over and over again, they were able to complete the maze faster. And they were able to do that faster because they were actually logging the map in their brain. If you close your eyes for just a moment and think to yourself, and you do it, right? We're all going to get eyes closed here on a webinar, in the interwebs today. I've got my eyes closed and I'm thinking about where I grew up as a kid. I can think about the street. I can think about my house. I can think about my neighbors, where I rode my bike, maybe where I kissed my first love interest, maybe where I played, sports, or I scraped my knee, or maybe broke a window. I can think about where the grocery store was, the comic book store. And in your brain, you have a layout. This is called a cognitive map, or a mind map of your experience. Now, what's interesting, as I continue to keep my eyes closed, if you were to think about this spot and somebody else had the same spot in their brain, you would not be thinking about the same cognitive map, right? Everybody can open their eyes. Your experience, your cognitive map is unique to you, right? If you are a paraplegic, you are going to have a different view on life based on your circumstance. And you may pay attention to certain things like ADA crosswalks or other things that help you be mobile in this environment, whereas other people may not think of those things. Or if you are an adult versus a child, or your gender, your experience, your whatever, everything plays into our cognitive maps. What I want to convey here is that everybody uses maps every day to live. So if people are like, I think maps are stupid, I don't agree with them. Maps are how we live. That's how we get to work. That's how we walk around. It's literally, in some way, our brains map everything. You can't get around the map. It has been an evolutionary piece of our biological makeup since the beginning. And just another side tangent here, in the Bible, maps and land surveying are mentioned like dozens of times. And land surveying, which they joke is the second oldest profession on earth, I'm not going to talk about the first, but it's like we've known from day one, even back to cave paintings in Europe or Africa, and it's just a painting, like there were maps on where you would find the buffalo, or where would you find and the mammoth you needed to eat, or where was the river, right? Like we have evolved with maps, and it is an important part of our society, our culture, and our biological makeup. Another really interesting gentleman, he's still alive, is named Howard Gardner. Dr. Gardner has created what they call the theory of multiple intelligences. It was originally 7 intelligences, and I think he's expanded it to be 8. He's pretty legit. He's, just a psychologist at that school called Harvard. So, maybe we should think about it a little bit. But if you noticed here, it's got naturalist, musical, body kinesthetic, logical, mathematical, interpersonal, intrapersonal, linguistic. And to me, the most interesting of all this, check out that last one in the wheel. Ding, 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 spatial, visualizing the world in 3D. So one of these 8 intelligences is how we can actually be human beings. And some people have more interpersonal skills. Some people have more logical mathematical skills. And it's kind of a Venn diagram of everybody's makeup. But the important part is we all have some amount of spatial intelligence that we live our life by. You cannot get around it. Interesting side fact, another tangential comment here. Recently, I want to say about a month ago, it is the first time in US history that the average IQ scores, so the intelligent quotient of Americans has actually declined for the last 100 years of them tracking IQs. So right off the gate, what does that mean? Well, actually, we're not as smart as we were 100 years ago. Now, interestingly, if you dive into the study a little bit more, IQ has gone down in all aspects of what they measure, except, are you ready for this? Guess where the one place where our IQ has not gone down in 100 years? Spatial. So in the IQ, they actually have spatial reasoning as one of those things. And because we have become a tablet, smartphone, smart device, cell phone culture, the whole world has, everything you do on a smartphone, tablet, or computer is very spatial. You're no longer reading text, right? You're actually seeing a map. You're playing Pokemon with a map and augmented reality, and you're running around your local park, right? You have this spatialness inherently built into phones, tablets, and computers. So again, I just want to throw it out there that you can't get around maps. We use them whether you like it or not. All right, so I'm going to take a break here for just 2 seconds. I love this book. Let's just remember that even from childhood, maps have been talked about. So if you're like me and you're a Cat in a Hat fan, you're a fan of Dr. Seuss. I grew up reading these books. This is a book that you can still buy. It's actually a little bit newer. It's about $8 on Amazon. I own a copy of it. It's absolutely great. And if I give this presentation live, I literally read the book. You're like, oh my God, are we really sitting on and lunch and learn? This dude's about to start playing, Cat in the Hat. Dr. Seuss for us? Well, you're absolutely correct. I am, because wait until you see this. What you're going to see is what they talk about to, third graders, second graders, first graders here are the fundamental pieces of a map that I would actually argue that the average GIS person has no idea about. We've disconnected in some way from GIS to maps. So let's just take a quick moment. I'm going to play this. And I highly recommend, if you're like me and you're the Lorax and you like to speak for the trees, check this out, especially if you have kids. Super fun. It's called There's a Map on My Lap.
There's a map on my lap. I am the Cat in the Hat, and I am happy to say there's a map on my lap. Let's get on our way. We will travel the world, see the whole USA, and still be back home by the end of the day. Maps are drawings that help to find out where you are and get where you're going, no matter how far. When map makers make maps, they must first decide who will be using the map and what it needs to do. The map of the Earth that we use most of all is a globe. Like the Earth, it is round as a ball. Peel the skin of an orange and lay it out flat. A flat map of the Earth would look something like that.
You guys picking up this real quick? This is literally projections, coordinate systems, datums, and the concepts of geodesy being told to kids, right? Have you ever thought about why you use a Kansas state plane projection? Because you don't want tearing, shearing, and basically the shifting of your data. This is literally explaining it to kids. I love it. I love it.
Now, if maps were the size of the places they show, map makers would run out of paper, and so a chart called a scale makes maps easy to use, shrinking miles into inches on each map that you choose. You can make a map of far places you roam or a map called a plan of your very own home. We used this scale. 1 inch equals 3 feet. It helped us do something we both think is neat. We drew our whole room so it fits on 1 sheet. There are 4 main directions. All maps have got them. North is on top, south down at the bottom. If you look to the right, that is where east will be. Look to the left, and it's west that you see. To remember all 4, here's one easy way. Never eat soggy wheat, is what I always say. I have here an atlas. Come on, take a look. You will find lots of maps, and they're all in this book. Sometimes maps use pictures to show where things are. A capital city is marked with a star. A tent shows a campsite. Tracks show where a train is. To get to the airport, just find where a plane is.
So I'm going to stop it there. And I would encourage you that after this, you can go find a used copy on Amazon, purchase it, buy it for your kids. If you've got a grandkid or a niece or a nephew or a neighbor, buy them this book. We need kids we need them to know what maps are. And I will also make a quick comment. Did you notice that they mentioned that maps, before we make a map, we need to know who we're making the map for, right? That another side thing here. Always been a pet peeve of mine when I would have employees or I worked with people that would make a map and they would just throw a bunch of stuff in there. It's like people who write to hit word limits, but don't care about the content. You always need to think about making a map for your intended audience. What are you trying to convey? What is the narrative of the map, right? If you're not having to do with water, why would you show water necessarily? If there's, what are the symbologies and the colors you're utilizing to convey this map to others? So this is an awesome book called There's a Map on My Lap. Highly encourage it. There's also some really fun map books out there now for kids by Esri. Also Get Kids into Survey. If you're interested, you can reach out to me afterwards and I will get that information for you.
There's a map.
So next thing I want to show you is this map. Maybe a little distorted. Hands up out there if you can go on your Zoom, you can give me a thumbs up. Anybody out there like like Lord of the Rings? Anybody out there maybe a big nerd, that at some point in their life, I see a couple thumbs up here. Yep, there's a couple. I see a yes. Okay, well, great. Oh, more people coming in. Brittany as well. Kaylin, yes, everybody seems to. Sadly not. Oh my goodness, Andrew, we have so much to review after this. Yeah, I'll send you the box set. Okay, so if you don't know what this is, I'm going to catch you up to 2023. This is Lord of the Rings. This is a series of books written by J.R.R. Tolkien. Oh, Star Wars Galaxy Map. I'm a huge Star Wars fan. Also Star Trek. I'm a big fan of all those maps. So yes, I love it, love it, love it. I'm also super nerdy. We can go into a really long, detailed conversation, but Battlestar Galactica is also really fun in terms of maps. But let's get back to Lord of the Rings. So for me, when I was growing up, my grandmother, Gigi in Florida, literally gave me my first copy of The Hobbit. And I'm 40 this year, to put in context how old I am. And I remember that I was in this book it club, and it was like you read the book and you take a little quiz thing, and then you got pizza points, and you go to Pizza Hut to go get free pizza, personal pan pizza. This is how they encouraged kids in the 80s and 90s to read. Well, little did they know, my family and my grandma, that I absolutely freaking loved Lord of the Rings and I loved reading. And my mom promised me she would always buy me a book. I'm 40 and I still ask mom to buy me books. I think I got the good end of that deal. They wanted me to read, and now she's been financing my nerdiness for a long time. Additionally, my grandmother actually had this Lord of the Rings Middle Earth map, Middle Earth being the name of the area, up on her wall in her little back room. I call it a library, but we were very, very middle to lower class. It was not necessarily a library. She also just liked reading. Anywho, I digress. Why is this important? Well, for me, as a little toddler kid, middle schooler, I'm looking up at this map on the wall, and my brain is just going crazy. It's thinking about where the cast of characters, the Lord of the Rings crew, right? Like the Fellowship, where were they going? What was the track they went on? How did that track compare to the Hobbit's track? And if you're really super nerdy, where does the Silmarillion play into all of this? And this got me excited about forests, whether it was Muirwood or these different Fangorn forest, right, where they meet the Ents. And I'm thinking like, all of a sudden I'm like, well, do forests, how does that ecologically in a geographic space compare to mountains? And how do the plains, I'm like thinking through Rohan and gone, yes, I'm very nerdy, everybody, if you haven't thought about that. I haven't realized that yet. But my point is, this got my brain going as a kid. And it never ended. And, whether it's Lord of the Rings or this, perhaps, how do Ents moving affect forest maps? That is an awesome question. And I think we should make a comic out of that. We could make a pretty funny meme, avoiding LiDAR like Sasquatch, AKA Ents. Yes. Yeah, you know what? The Silmarillion is actually scares me as well. Quite frankly, I've tried to read it about 6 times, and I think out of the 6 times, if you combine them all together, I've gotten through it once. It's very hard. It's dense. But anywho, life. You guys remember this game? So board games. You remember sitting down as a kid with your family and playing a board game, right? Like before computers existed. And it was like this moment where we were using spatial reasoning to have fun with our family. This was impactful for you, right? Or maybe Chutes and Ladders if you you were into that sort of thing, or Snakes and Ladders, I guess, if you're in the South. Depending where you are geographically, I guess one was used or the other. But do you guys remember playing games like this? Like, this is what got me into liking maps. Or perhaps Zelda. So, if you're old like me and you played some video games in your early childhood, this Zelda map, I remember getting in a Nintendo Power magazine. I used to cut grass of all my neighbors, save the money up, and I would get a magazine called Nintendo Power. And the centerfold in the middle of Nintendo Power was not something where your brain may go with centerfold. It was actually this pixelated map of Zelda, right? And this stuck in my head. And the crazy thing is, if I close my eyes right now and you asked me to draw this map out for you, I would remember a huge deal of it. Like, I don't know why, but I remember this map like it's the back of my hand. There's something to that. Or how about when I was in high school? So check this out. This is actually, I still have this. This dates back to 1999, sorry. And I was reading Dante's Inferno in English AP, I remember. And instead of taking notes, I drew out the levels of hell. And this is my drawing from, again, over 20 years ago, of how my brain stored the information from a pretty complex book written in the Renaissance. And it was the way I understood it. And actually, my teacher at the time, Mr. Ryan, came over. He snatched this off of my desk. He yelled at me saying I wasn't paying attention and that I was drawing in class. And I argued with him. He sent me to the office. I got in trouble and went to detention. I got my picture back, but at the end of the day, my parents were actually proud of me. This was me like this. And there's nothing on this map about me not paying attention in class. In fact, this was me using maps to better understand the book, right? How novel this may be. Again, maps are part of us no matter what. But another example of maps being utilized in modern culture to explain a very complex book. Again, love it. So let's take maybe a more academic approach. I'm at 30 minutes in. I think we're tracking pretty well. These are 3 books, or 3 things. Well, 2 of them are books. One is a poster. The one on the left by Mon Monkiar, if you've not heard of, I absolutely recommend reading as well. And it's called How to Lie with Maps. Perhaps you've read or heard of the line, How to Lie with Statistics. Well, it's just as easy to lie with maps. Imagine that. We just went through COVID, and think about all of the controversy about COVID mapping and how people are reporting what happened with COVID. Think about wars like what's happening in Ukraine and how propaganda impacts maps. So it's really easy to lie to your reader if you're intending to do that. Of course, that's not what I'm going to intend you to do, but it's something we need to consider. Or in the middle, magnificent maps, power, propaganda, and art, Peter Barber and Tom Harper. Another great example of how maps throughout history have really dictated the world. I mean, wars have been started based on what was drawn on a map. Whole continent, I mean, if it wasn't for the map drawn in the 1400s, Christopher Columbus probably would have never have set sail to try to go west, right? Some of the original maps drawn by Marco Polo and say from the Mongols, when the Mongolians invaded and Genghis Khan came over from Asia Minor and into the West, into Europe, they left maps. These maps have predicated and dictated like how the world has functioned. And today, they still do. Actually, one of the fun things I like to do, another nerdy moment here, I love to see globes and maps and look at them and see what countries are represented. Myanmar, for an example, is a great a place to look. Depending on how old it is, it may be called Myanmar, or it may have been called its other name, or, even you go way far back, things like Constantinople and Istanbul, right? Not to quote a funny song from the 90s. But also on the right-hand side, maps are weapons. National security demands accurate maps. In World War I and World War II, there were big pushes by the government to literally to get people on board because they needed maps to win the wars. Bryant mentions in the chat the 9-dash line. Oh my goodness, talking about probably the most consequential dashed line in our time today, contemporarily. Brian, that's so on point. That's a bad topology joke, on point. If you're not picking up what Brian's referring to, he's talking about the South China Sea and the shipping lanes that there's like 4 or 5 countries, including the Philippines, Taiwan, etc. They're all vying over, and China is, as of right now, I'm not making any comments on opinion or anything, but they're building airfields in the middle of the ocean to secure those zones. And by flashpoint, hotpoint, this is that area that, God forbid, and I pray against all the time, but, if we don't do something internationally, this could be the next conflict zone in the world. So, and that all is based on where China thinks its shipping is and its territorial claims are, where Japan thinks it is, where's Philippines. And, the truth usually is in the middle. They probably all have some claim to this area that is substantial in their own view. But that dotted line could cause a lot of problems. Or think about the dotted lines in Ukraine right now, the Donbass region, Crimea. These are dotted lines on a map that have massive, massive consequence. What if we make a new island? I don't know. I'm not sure we need to be making any new islands out there, but I suppose we could do it as well. I also want to say that not all maps are created equally, right? So here are a bunch of propaganda maps, and from different times, time zones, conflicts, etc. I guess I wanted to show you here the interesting sort of symbology or iconography related with bad things. Do you notice something here? Like whoever the bad thing is being portrayed on these maps are associated with either octopuses or spiders. So these long, like tentacle things, yes, the age of imperialism is spot on. Whether you were, for the Brits, against the Brits, were you Soviets, were you, we don't need to get into all of this today, but there's a whole lot of stuff being portrayed here. And, so be careful when you look at a map, right? There's a lot of stuff that can be assumed, and we don't want to be assuming anything because we know the assumptions are the mother of all beep beeps, all mess ups. And so as stewards of maps, we are called to make good maps, to be good stewards of data, to follow things like OGC standards and FDGIC metadata. And as truly as ethics people, if you're a GISP like me, for an example, we take a code of ethics pretty seriously, that we're not going to use maps for ill purposes, and so these things are important to realize. Here's another fun map I like to talk about. It's a little faded because it's zoomed in, but this is called Tabula Rogerina. And its author is the gentleman in the lower right-hand corner, and his name is Muhammad al-Idrisi II. And I'm sorry, Muhammad al-Idrisi. And this took place, I want to say, right around the 1100s. And it's a really neat testament of how maps can actually be inclusive. So Muhammad was a Muslim from North Africa, I believe Morocco, and he was obviously very good at cartography. He was a famous cartographer. And Roger II of Sicily actually hired him to, up until this point, make one of the most detailed maps of the Earth. And if you like type in most famous maps on Earth, like this map usually pops up, and you can see obviously the scale and distortion is a little crazy. It looks like almost like a Mario Brothers map to me. I don't know why, but I love it because it shows how maps can transcend cultures. I'm not 100% sure, Andrew, exactly what the Islamic era was during this time, but I believe you're correct. I think Islam started somewhere around 600 to 800 AD. And so that I think this was the height. I'm not, yeah, so I could be incorrect. Please don't quote me on that. More so that I love the fact that quote unquote, a Muslim and Islam practitioner was able to go into Italy, the bastion of Catholicism, and was hired for their skills, right? They were able, like, it didn't matter the color or the ethnicity or this, what they believed. They were hired because maps are important. And to me, that's pretty kick-arse. That's pretty sweet. There's another fun map here. So if you've not heard of Gerardus Mercator around the 1500s, perhaps you've seen the coordinate system called Universal Transmercator, UTM. That's actually based off of Mercator. And without this guy, Mercator actually was able to come up with the concept of distance and bearings for sea travel. And he used parallels and prime meridians to basically help navigation purposes. It is the navigation method that allowed the first explorers to come across the Atlantic Ocean and make it. This projection is still partially used today and actually wraps into WGS 84 as well. Long story short, though, it's interesting. It's not the shortest way to get to a point, but it's time true and tested, right? So the curvature of the Earth kind of makes things a little crazy. But long story short, I love the fact that we're still using something from medieval ages, in today's terms. Pretty famous map. If you haven't heard about that, check out Gerardus Mercator. It's from Belgium. By the way, fun side story. I got to go to the Geospatial World Forum in the Netherlands a few months ago, and my partner went down and did a trip into Belgium to meet with some partners for Bad Elf. And they were near, their office was near where he was born. And when you walked, and they make GPS boards for GPS units, but on the front of their main office door, they had a huge placard for Gerardus Mercator because they were proud of him being from Belgium. So I thought that was pretty cool. This person also, Joseph Minard. This is one of my favorite maps out there. Love to see anybody in the chat or participants. Has anybody ever heard of this map? Joseph Minard's kind of the map of March to Russia. I see an eye. I see a couple things. The thumbs up, Sherry and Amy. Perfect. I love this map because it's one of the maps that it's a weird looking map. It just doesn't look like something standard. But the story it tells is amazing. So early 1800s, Joseph Minard Joseph Minard makes a map of Napoleon's march to Moscow. And so what you're seeing on this, Daniel, I agree. Thank you, Dr. Goodchild. I love Dr. Goodchild. He's one of my favorite. I have actually another presentation where I mentioned Dr. Goodchild. I've had the privilege of meeting him a few times. I've never had a class with him. But probably one of the best geographers out there right now. Anywho, so Joseph Minard, in this depiction, he's showing in the orangish salmon color, that is representative, the width of that line is representative of how many soldiers Napoleon had at the beginning of his march towards Moscow to conquer all of Europe and into Russia. And so on the very far western side here, you see a river, right? And you can see there, it's hard to tell, but there was 422,000 men in the French military at that time. And what you can follow here is how the French military got all the way to Moscow. And by the time they got to Moscow, the size of the military was 100,000. So they had attrition of over 75%. So 3 out of 4 men died on the way to Russia, right? And so this is where you hear about kind of the scorched earth policy, that you can't take Russia over in the winter because it's really hard to get armies. And that's been basically true since the beginning of time. And so you can actually see the different cities and how the battles and sizes and the rivers and some of the offshoots. But also interestingly, this black line that goes back west from Moscow, this is the army as it's retreating back to France. And the 422,000 person army gets back to France with only 10,000 men. Holy crud, Batman. I mean, that is nuts. That is 412,000 people died on this campaign in a year. I mean, that is almost unfathomable, unconscionable to me. And how do you depict something like that? Well, Joseph Menard did a pretty awesome job, if you ask me. Yeah, so just absolutely amazing. Pretty cool map. Check this map out. Maybe you'll dig it as much as I do. So back to Game of Thrones. We talk about Jon Snow. A lot of times I say Jon Snow and people immediately think about, the Night's Watchman, Jon Snow. Yes, one of my favorite characters. And while the last season was hard to make everybody happy, I had no problem with what happened to Jon Snow. I thought it was okay. Anywho, put a bow on it and move on. But this is not the Jon Snow I'm actually talking about. This is the Jon Snow I'm talking about. So I'm guessing at this point, most people out there have probably seen Jon Snow, the epidemiologist who mapped cholera outbreaks in London in the early 1800s. Jon Snow was this map you see here on the left. While it looks simple, is sort of one of the first GIS maps ever to exist. And what I mean by that is it's an analytical map that doesn't just have utilitarian purpose. It has, it's not just telling a story, it's analyzing the story. The map led to his analysis of where cholera was outbreaking. So what you see there, the dark areas that he's scribbled in on the left-hand side, these dark blocks, these are actually incident areas of cholera mapped out in London, right? You can see the streets and everything. Up over here on the top right-hand corner, this is just a screenshot of incidents used. Basically, they took the map, they put it into ArcScene, made it 3-dimensional, and they made stacks of where incident rates were. Interesting. And again, for the today, okay, whatever. That's, we do that in GIS all the time today. But this was really novel back in the early 1800s. And in fact, he did this before germ theory existed. So if you don't know what that is, go check out what germ theory is. And so we didn't know germs existed in the early 1800s, really. We didn't know there were atomic looking things. We didn't know that you could use a look down and find germs, and that caused illness. So it's pretty fantastic on what he was able to accomplish. And fun story with Jon Snow. Do you know, does anybody out there know where they did not find cholera and where they found cholera? Actually, what he was able to determine was, where they found cholera? Sources of water. So wells. Wells were distribution centers for cholera, which makes sense. And you know where he found less cholera outbreaks? And this is true to my heart. Ready for this? The taverns. Yeah, bars. So if you didn't want to get cholera, you needed to go have a few pints down at the bar and, go watch your Richmond game if you're a Ted Lasso fan. Because what happened is when they would make the beer and the wine and the grog and all of that, basically you ferment the water, and so it kills off the cholera. And so actually, yeah, fun fact, Benjamin Franklin said beer is proof that God loves us. And so maybe Jon Snow was able to catch on to that a little bit. Yeah, so I also want to quickly mention, this is a friend of mine. His name is Dr. Kenneth Field. Dr. Field works for Esri. He does a lot of stuff on how to make maps and cartography. This is a great book of his. If you go to the Esri users conferences, or you have a chance to maybe ask him to be a keynote speaker for your organization, he's amazing. He came in to my Arizona State class when I lived in Phoenix. I teach online now because I'm in Texas. But he came in and we had a conference on the 150 years of mapping the Grand Canyon. So the quintessential, I can't say, not centennial, but the quintessential, whatever the 150-year mark. Anyway, he made a map a number of years back for this. And it was called Over the Edge, Death in the Grand Canyon. And when he came out with this, it was the most viewed map on the internet for a while. And he mapped, and it was also the most deathly related, gruesome map on the internet. And what he did is he actually mapped all the deaths of in the Grand Canyon. And this map is actually three-dimensional. You can put glasses on, stereographic glasses, and see it. And I actually had a huge wall mount, and I kept it in my classroom at ASU. Students loved it. But it's pretty funny. You can look through here, and it's a really neat representation, but it maps all the types of deaths. What kind of deaths would there be in the Grand Canyon? Well, you know, heat stroke, stuff like that. You'd guess maybe rattlesnake bite. Or what I found to be pretty interesting was people getting pushed off ledges. Like, I don't want to be married to this person anymore. And whoop, there he goes. He's over the edge. Or helicopter crash deaths. Like, there's some really weird stuff. And so up until this point, Dr. Field made this really neat map, and he was able to take this very gruesome topic of death in the Grand Canyon and make this super neat map. It literally was the most comprehensive and complete history of the Grand Canyon misadventures. And if you've never looked at this map, check it out online. Dr. Field is awesome. Another friend of mine, Carl Churchill. Carl was a student of mine in a master's program at ASU. He's now a graphics reporter at the Wall Street Journal. He made a story map about a conflict in Africa for about a year. It was the most viewed story map online. But talk about somebody who gets to make really cool maps for a living for the Wall Street Journal, right? Like, all he does is make cool maps. So if you get a moment, you can look for Carl Churchill, look for his stuff out there. He has some pretty amazing maps. John Nelson is also another person I'll throw out there. He makes some really good maps as well. So be remiss if I didn't talk about the COVID dashboard. We talked about Kenneth Field's map being the most deadly map up until that point. Well, then COVID hit, and this changed the world. Everybody in the world saw this map at some point. I remember for the first few months of COVID, when we were in lockdown, my wife and I had a tablet up in our house, and the COVID dashboard was constantly on our tablet all day, every day. It was dismal. It was awful. I don't know how COVID was for y'all. Any rate, it was not great. But what this did was it disseminated online collaborative mapping to the world, and it really changed the game. And so dashboard maps like this are kind of the wave of the future, and just an amazing way to disseminate knowledge out there. So this is pretty impressive stuff, right? Like, everybody was using GIS in COVID, and they didn't even know it. Shout out, I mentioned at the very beginning of this, I think that we are in the geospatial moment. I absolutely poached that from another friend of mine. His name is Keith Masbeck. Keith Masbeck used to be one of the geospatial intelligence officers way up high in the geospatial intelligence agency. He was also military. He's an angel investor now in most space technologies. I am participant. I'm a co-host on a podcast called the Geoholics. Episode 124, you can see on the screen, we had Keith on, and he talked about the geospatial moment, and I have run with that since. Keith's awesome. And plug to the Geoholics. You can find us on Spotify. You can find us Apple Podcasts, all the normal places. We have about 135,000 active listeners right now, and we pop out an episode once a week. Check out episode 124. We talk about what we're in. We're in this geospatial moment. It's time for us to be stewards of maps, stewards of data. And he just says some very compelling things, and it's very exciting to be in this age. So who makes these maps? You make the maps. Who needs to be the steward of these data? You need to be the stewards of these data. This is the calling. Let's take the excitement of maps to everybody. And that's basically where I want to wrap up. You can see, like I said, I jacked the geospatial moment. This is something I speak to a lot. This is me on LinkedIn. Please reach out to me. You can email me at nick@bad-elf.com. You can find me on Arizona State's website if you want to go through more of a academic route, but that was my presentation. And I told you we would have nothing technical. My whole goal here was to have a little bit of a story time on why maps are marvelous. And hopefully you agree with me. So that's all I got.